Many considered the Beatles to be enormously famous rock musicians. They were incredibly talented, immensely popular, and they altered the course of music irrevocably. They too experienced highs and lows, just like everyone else. Life was never easy for the Fab Four, despite their fame and fortune. Today marks the 51st anniversary of the breakup of the Beatles. Paul McCartney is currently being forthright about what transpired. Can you tell me who was responsible for the breakup of the Beatles? What gave them the will to argue and complain? Despite driving each other mad, they managed to produce consistently excellent music. Paul McCartney, what's he up to now? Along for the ride as we dive into this and more. Paul McCartney was falsely accused of disbanding the Beatles for half a century. In April of 1970, he shocked everyone by releasing his first solo album, breaking the news that the Fab Four had broken up. But according to him, it was John Lennon who quit the band, not himself. With whom did the Beatles experiment? Historiography continues to paint McCartney in a negative light. He spoke to the BBC in October 2121 and said, "People saw it that way, so I rolled with it. No, that was my only option." A woman named Yoko Ono. Why then was Paul McCartney held responsible for the dissolution of the most famous band in history? After 50 years, why is he still interested in altering the plot? The end came for the Beatles in August 1966, when they stopped performing. This was the pinnacle of their musical career. With singles like Sgt. It meant they weren't as close as they had been during the height of Beatlemania. Pepper. The foursome broadened their interests and made new friends outside of the band. Among his newfound friends, John Lennon's partner Yoko Ono was the most famous. May of 1968 was when they first crossed paths. The concept of a bandmate is ubiquitous in rock music. Many people believe this to be the main cause of band disbandment. The Beatles are a perfect example of this. Late 1968 and early 1969 were tough times for John and Yoko. Despite their drug issues, miscarriage, and the cruel treatment they received in Britain, their relationship ultimately improved. But as we can see from Jackson's art, even the Beatles weren't surprised. A statement made by Paul McCartney in January 1969 during their recording session read, "They're making a big deal out of this." However, John does that frequently. In 50 years from now, people will laugh when they say, they broke up because Yoko sat on an amplifier. The four Beatles suspected there were additional factors contributing to the band's dissolution even as it was unfolding. Did you know that the band's first departing member was none other than Ringo Starr? The Beatles were in the midst of recording White Album in August of 1968. Ringo Starr, the band's drummer at the time, was so dissatisfied with his position that he left for 2 weeks. In the documentary anthology, Ringo made the statement, "I didn't expect, even though I was on my own, I felt like I played well, and the other three seemed to be enjoying themselves immensely. We got along famously, but there was no magic." They continued to refine the album after Starr returned. Though, working on Get Back in January 1969 was a really trying time for George Harrison. The artist saw Bob Dylan and the band in New York City after releasing the White Album in October. The Woodstock Fair, he was really impressed by how they collaborated to create music. He returned to London with John and Paul, but their unfinished projects took precedence over his songs. A lot of George's songs, like Something, were superior to the band's other efforts, and this eventually led to a breakdown. 10 days ago in 1961, after a disagreement over lunch, George informed the other Beatles that he was leaving. George was asked to meet with the other Beatles despite their nasty comments about Eric Clapton replacing him. They reasoned that if they recorded an album, instead of attending the live performance, Harrison would return. In the end, how did they part ways? With this the Beatles have disbanded. The Beatles broke up permanently when John Lennon left in September 1969. The Fab Four reunited in the spring and summer of 1969 to record their third studio album. This particular one was known as Abbey Road. Finalizing the task at hand, Lennon, on September 9, McCartney and Harrison got together to plot their future. The meeting was recorded so that Ringo could listen to it at a later time. On the tape, Lennon proposed that they record an additional album for George, featuring additional songs, and he requested that Paul omit some of his more well-known compositions, such as Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Paul stated in an interview, "When we enter the studio, no matter how bad things get, Ringo will keep playing drums, and I will keep playing bass." But in the same week, Eric Clapton, Yoko Ono, and Lennon all traveled to Canada to perform at the Toronto Rock and Roll Festival. John soloed on a few of his new songs. The weekend in question decided to leave the Beatles permanently. Lennon announced, "I want a divorce" during a September 20th meeting with their record company, EMI, to sign a new deal. An excerpt from Paul McCartney's anthology states that John had informed him, "I wasn't going to tell you until after we signed the contract, but I'm leaving the group." While we were still in disbelief, we signed the new agreement. Yet another crucial factor that led to the tragic incident in August 1967 was the catalyst for their breakup. Their 5-year manager, Brian Epstein, passed away unexpectedly, causing numerous problems for the company. At about the same time, the band decided to take matters into their own hands financially and formed Apple Corp. However, they required a new manager to rein in their spending and get their finances in order. Paul had his father-in-law's business run by Paul, but the famous American businessman Alan Klein was chosen by John, George, and Ringo. Performed alongside musicians, they kept John's whereabouts a secret because Klein helped them negotiate a better deal with their record label. The Beatles were able to increase their budget thanks to Klein's business acumen. Their song sales are at an all-time high. However, something was still off. Lennon and McCartney lost out on the opportunity to own their songs when Northern Songs, the company that released their music, went public. Michael Jackson in the 1980s owned the songs because of this mistake. But things just got worse. Klein was well liked by Little Richard, but Paul was opposed to letting him manage his finances. When things escalated significantly, Paul then took action. But his actual actions were what? Paul McCartney's Move song. As discord within the Beatles began to grow in the late 60s, Paul McCartney's Move members pursued solo careers in music. The late John Lennon, who was the Plastic Ono Band, was his latest endeavor. His boldness has made him famous. His previous work with the Beatles was drastically different from this. This new project was an opportunity for Lennon to express and share his singular artistic vision. As far as Paul McCartney's an extremely personal issue. He began working on his debut album solo, but he used a false identity throughout. To maintain his anonymity and the air of secrecy around his project, he adopted the alias Billy Martin. This allowed McCartney to compose music independently. Impact or consequence. John Lennon wanted to revisit some of the Beatles' earlier songs during this period. In other words, he sought Phil Spector's assistance while working on the Get Back recordings from the year before. They intended to release an album featuring the band's unreleased songs. However, McCartney was dissatisfied with the outcome. It was what really got under his skin was Spector's handling of the tapes. According to McCartney, Spector's method of working involved over-composing his songs, which diminished their initial simplicity and rawness. On the morning of April 10, 1970, a devastating report was published in the British newspaper the Daily Mirror, which had an international impact and made matters worse. The news spread about Paul leaving the Beatles. A significant turning point was hinted at by this narrative. It was now official. Paul McCartney had indeed left the band, as he had previously decided. However, this news did not sit well with John Lennon. He had intended to inform everyone about the Beatles' breakup over 6 months ago, but he had delayed doing so. In any case, McCartney's departure was becoming new, and the Lennon attempted an indirect form of revenge later that year. In an interview that pushed and tore apart people's perceptions of the Beatles, he was forthright and furious with Rolling Stone. During this discussion, Lennon expressed his disapproval of feedback on the group's style and performance. He pointed out, to make it you had to be a jerk, and the Paul McCartney letter Beatles were the jerks in the world. The way his former bandmates dealt with his girlfriend, Yoko Ono, was another source of his wrath. They were denounced by Lennon. All of them sat there and passed judgment on us like a fucking jury. He spoke of his inability to forgive them. In contrast, Paul McCartney chose to remain composed in the face of the worsening situation. He preferred a more direct approach and preferred to avoid public disputes. John Paul McCartney penned to put an end to speculation that they might reconcile by sending a letter to the Melody Maker's letters page. He made it clear in his correspondence to put an end to the limping dog of a news story that has been dragging itself across your pages for the past year. My answer to the question, will the Beatles get together again, is no. One is Paul McCartney's apple pot lost. Now, Alan Klein, the Beatles manager, made sure that every penny earned by the band members' solo endeavors would go into a special apple pot. The goal here was to guarantee that all members of the group would get a fair share of the funds. However, Paul McCartney eventually came to feel that this arrangement was restricting his financial and creative freedom. He was unhappy with the management of his solo work and how it was impacting his personal finances. With that in mind, McCartney began dissolving the Beatles' partnership in August 1970. He emphasized the significance of autonomy in his creative and financial decision-making. No matter how much effort he put in, the problem could not be solved due to pre-existing contracts and collective agreement. Going to court was the only way to end the stalemate. By suing John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney in the London High Court on December 31, 1970, McCartney made a significant move away from his bandmates, Apple Corp., which was in charge of their company. Ringo Starr, Harrison, and Starr, members of the Beatles, and any companies associated with them, were officially asked to dissolve in the lawsuit. Due to its complexity and significance, the case dragged on into the early 1970s. After a protracted legal struggle, the judge finally found in McCartney's favor. The Beatles were thus rendered a non-entity under the law. On December 29, 1974, the Beatles formally disbanded. At that moment, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon would all depart from the band. It was established that Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison were not members of the same band, but rather four individuals. Now it was official. The revolutionary band that changed rock music forever. The Beatles had broken up. At long last, a new chapter had begun, and the Paul McCartney suddenly became an independent artist. What was his post-band activity? Reign following the Fab Four. Paul McCartney's depression began after the breakup of the Beatles in the late 60s and early 70s. A major hit to his ego came with the dissolution of the band, which he had grown to rely on. He was generally hit hard by life. Linda McCartney's wife played a crucial role in helping her husband get through this tough time. Her encouragement and compliments on his songwriting encouraged him to keep creating music. The moving song, Maybe I'm Amazed, was written by McCartney as a tribute to Linda's support and the significant role she played in his life. He expresses his gratitude and in the song's lyrics for Linda's support as he goes through this difficult time. He pointed out, "That's how I felt. Maybe I'm amazed at what's going on. Excuse me. There may not be any other woman who can assist me if I am a man, but you might. Will you not enlighten me, darling? Excuse me. You suspended me in midair and wrenched me from the fabric of time. That's mind-boggling to me. You are absolutely necessary to me. For Linda, every love song I write is for Linda," McCartney added, revealing how much she meant to him. With the release of his self-titled debut album in 1970, McCartney launched his solo career. It peaked at #1 on the US charts and was a massive success. It was primarily McCartney's solo effort. He composed the music, played the instruments, and sang lead. Although Linda contributed vocals, McCartney was mostly responsible for the album's production. Along with Linda and drummer Denny Seiwell, he continued his solo career the following year with the recording of Rain. This album was also a success, penetrating the US top 5 and the UK top 1. Songs like Uncle Albert and Admiral Halsey, which stood out on the album, reached #1 in the United States. Later that year, Linda and guitarist Denny Laine joined McCartney in forming a new band called Wings, further expanding McCartney's musical career. Who were former members of the Moody Blues. Wings were always a difficult idea, was McCartney's reaction to the difficulty of forming a new band. Excuse me. Any band would have a tough time replicating the Beatles' success. Excuse me. It was exactly the same for me. The thing is, you could choose between leaving off or continuing, and the thought of leaving off music was too painful for me. The couple's daughter, Stella McCartney, was born in September 1971. Linda took the name Stella from her two grandmothers, who were also named Stella. It was a joyful and creative period for McCartney as he entered a new phase of his life. Enjoy the Wings on tour for yourself. After recruiting guitarist irrevocably, Paul McCartney's new band Wings embarked on their debut concert tour in 1972. A meager audience of 700 people witnessed their debut performance at the University of Nottingham. In their early unscheduled tours, the band primarily played at various universities. To keep expenses down and maintain an easygoing vibe, they slept in simple places while traveling from gig to gig in a van. The students at each location paid them with small change. It is intriguing to note that these performances did not feature any Beatles songs, but rather their new material. After the fact, McCartney explained that they went this route by stating that he wanted to escape the scrutiny